The dust of Devil's Hollow settled on everything, a fine red shroud that clung to hope and choked it silent. It coated the parched slats of the buildings, which leaned against each other as if for comfort, their windows like vacant eyes staring out at the unforgiving expanse of rock and sun-bleached earth. Into this tableau of quiet desperation rolled Isabella Whitmore's wagon, an apparition of polished oak and black lacquered iron. It was a vessel of another world, its canvas cover a crisp, defiant white against the muted landscape, its brass fittings gleaming with a memory of rain and green pastures. It spoke of order, of means, of a future meticulously planned, a future that was already dead. Isabella sat ramrod straight on the driver's bench, her hands, clad in immaculate leather gloves, holding the reins with a stillness that belied the tremor in her soul. She had come to marry Caleb Dixon, a man she knew only through 3 years of carefully composed letters, his words painting a picture of a decent life, a respectable partnership in a town that, while rugged, held promise. The letters had been her lifeline, a bridge out of the suffocating stillness of her life back east after her father's passing. She inquired after him at the sheriff's office, a squat building that smelled of stale tobacco and sweat. The sheriff, a man whose face was a roadmap of disappointments, removed his hat with a weary sigh. "Caleb Dixon? Ma'am, Caleb took a fever 2 months back. Buried him up on the ridge." The words were delivered with the flat finality of a hammer striking a nail. They struck Isabella with a physical force, driving the air from her lungs. The world tilted, the edges of her vision blurring. The sheriff's voice droned on, offering condolences that sounded like judgments, his eyes sweeping over her fine clothes, her magnificent wagon, and the unmistakable foolishness of her quest. The future she had so carefully packed and transported across a continent had evaporated into the cruel, dry air. She managed a clipped, formal nod, the discipline of her upbringing the only thing holding her together. She walked out into the oppressive sunlight, the eyes of the townspeople like tiny, sharp stones against her skin. Whispers followed her, thin and venomous as snakes in the dust. They saw a spinster, abandoned and foolish, a disruption to their hard-won, miserable equilibrium. She reached the sanctuary of her wagon, her movements stiff and automatic. Once inside, with the canvas flaps secured, the facade crumbled. She sank onto a velvet-cushioned bench, her gloved hands covering her face as a dry, ragged sob escaped her throat. Here, everything was as it should be. Polished silver tea service secured in its felt-lined niche. Books bound in leather, their spines perfectly aligned. Linens smelling of lavender, folded with geometric precision. It was a world of control, of quiet dignity, and it was a lie. She was adrift in a sea of red dust, her compass shattered, her destination a fresh grave on a barren hill. As dusk bled across the sky, casting long, skeletal shadows from the bluffs, she peered through a small gap in the canvas. She saw them then for the first time. A flicker of movement at the edge of town, near the dry creek bed. A tall, gaunt man, his shoulders slumped in a posture of permanent defeat, and 3 small shadows clinging to him. They were ragged, spectral, a family of ghosts haunting the fringes of a town that had already cast them out. Isabella let the canvas fall, her own despair suddenly feeling indulgent, a luxury she could no longer afford. The silence in her perfect wagon was absolute, the silence of a tomb. The days that followed blurred into a monotonous cycle of heat and dust. Isabella remained a prisoner in her wagon, venturing out only to procure water and the barest necessities. Each trip to the general store was an ordeal. The whispers grew louder, the stares more pointed. She was an oddity, a woman of apparent quality who refused to simply disappear. Her polished world was an insult to their collective struggle. She paid for her goods with coins that seemed too bright, her formal posture a rebuke to their weary slump. They did not know that inside the wagon, the order was beginning to fray. A fine layer of red dust had infiltrated her sanctuary, coating the silver, dulling the polished wood. Her carefully rationed hope was dwindling as quickly as her supplies. It was during one of these stifling afternoons that she saw him again, no longer a spectral figure, but a man of flesh and bone, etched with hardship. Elias Boone. She had learned his name from the acidic gossip of the storekeeper. A man who had lost his wife, his homestead, everything. Now he and his 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, all of them with their father's serious eyes, survived on the town's grudging charity and whatever scraps he could find. She watched from her veiled window as he tried to mend a broken strap on his boy's shoe with a piece of twine, his large, chapped hands surprisingly gentle. The little girl, Sarah, coughed a dry, persistent hack that tore at the quiet air. Later, she saw the oldest boy, Thomas, dart behind the mercantile, only to be dragged out moments later by the furious proprietor, a half-eaten apple clutched in his small fist. The store owner shook him, shouting, while Elias ran over, his face a mask of shame and fury, pulling the boy away and pressing a few worn coins into the man's hand. Elias said nothing to his son. He simply took his hand and led his small, hungry family back toward the shadows of the creek bed. Isabella felt a sharp, unfamiliar pang in her chest. It was not pity. It was a cold, hard anger. That evening, the sky turned a bruised purple. The wind began to moan through the hollow, whipping dust into stinging clouds. It carried the scent of rain, a rare and violent promise. Isabella lit her lamp, the warm glow a small circle of defiance against the growing gloom. She thought of the children, huddled under a rocky overhang, the wind tearing at their thin clothes. She looked at the empty space in her wagon, at the spare blankets folded neatly on a bunk. The thought was madness. It was imprudent. It was a violation of every rule of propriety she had ever known. But the image of the little girl's cough, of the boy's desperate hunger, of the father's silent shame, would not leave her. She pulled on her cloak, took the lamp, and stepped out into the wind. She found them sheltered, as she'd imagined, against a low cliff face. Elias rose as she approached, positioning himself between her and his children, a silent, weary guard. "Mr. Boone," she said, her voice steady, though she had to raise it against the wind. He just watched her, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. "I have food," she said, holding up a small bundle. "In a warm place." She gestured with her head back toward the faint light of her wagon. "The storm will be severe." Elias's gaze was unyielding. Pride was etched into every line of his face, a last, defiant fortification against total ruin. He would starve before he would beg. "We're fine," he rasped, the words nearly lost to the wind. But then a gust tore at the thin blanket covering the children, and Isabella saw the little girl shiver violently. The child's wide, frightened eyes met hers. In that moment, something shifted. It was not about him or her. It was about them. "Your children are not fine," Isabella stated, her tone devoid of pity, leaving no room for argument. "My wagon is large and empty. It is foolish for it to remain so on a night like this." She held his gaze, a silent battle of wills fought in the rising gale. He looked from her determined face to his daughter, then to his 2 sons, huddled together for warmth. His pride was a worthy adversary, but the desperate hope in his children's eyes was an unbeatable force. He gave a single, sharp nod, the gesture of a man surrendering a fortress he could no longer defend. The interior of the wagon, which had felt so empty and silent to Isabella, was suddenly crowded with a fragile, breathing tension. The 3 children stood just inside the flap, their eyes wide with a mixture of awe and terror. They had never been inside such a place. Little Jacob, the youngest, reached out a grimy finger to touch the smooth, cool wood of the cabinet, pulling it back as if burned when his father shot him a sharp look. Sarah, the girl, stared at the neat row of books, her expression unreadable. Thomas, the eldest, simply stood stiffly, his gaze fixed on the floor, the shame of the stolen apple still clinging to him. Elias remained by the entrance, a sentry at the border of 2 worlds, his posture radiating a deep, uncomfortable suspicion. He did not belong here, and every line of his body said so. Isabella ignored the palpable discomfort, busying herself with practicalities. It was the only way she knew to navigate the treacherous currents of emotion. "There are blankets on the bunks," she said, her voice retaining its formal cadence. In a basin with water for washing, she turned to the small stove, her back to them, giving them a moment to acclimate. She prepared a simple meal of broth and bread, the movements familiar and calming. The aroma filled the small space, a warm, savory scent that spoke of comfort and normalcy. When she turned, the children had not moved, but their eyes were locked on the pot. She ladled the broth into 3 bowls she had set out on the small table. "Sit," she said gently. They looked to their father. Elias hesitated for a long moment, his jaw tight. Then he gave another of his curt nods, and the children scrambled to the bench, their earlier hesitation forgotten in the face of the steaming food. They ate with a silent, desperate speed that made Isabella's heart ache. Elias refused a bowl, accepting only a piece of bread, which he ate standing by the door, his eyes scanning the interior of the wagon as if searching for hidden threats. After they had eaten, Isabella showed the children how to wash their faces and hands in the basin. They approached the task with a solemnity usually reserved for church. The feel of the soft towel, the scent of the lye soap, it was all a foreign luxury. As she tucked them into the lower bunks, pulling the thick wool blankets up to their chins, little Sarah's hand darted out and her small, cool fingers brushed against Isabella's wrist. It was a fleeting touch, light as a moth's wing, but it sent a jolt through Isabella. The child's eyes were fixed on her, full of a question Isabella could not answer. She retreated to her own bunk, pulling a privacy curtain she had rigged across the wagon's center. In the darkness, she could hear the storm raging outside, the rain hammering against the canvas roof. But inside, there was the soft sound of breathing. For strangers, sharing her space, her air. Sleep did not come easily. She was acutely aware of Elias, a silent presence on the other side of the curtain. She heard him check on the children twice, his movements soft and sure in the dark. He was a good father, that much was clear. His love for them was a fierce, protective thing, the one untarnished treasure he still possessed. The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving the air washed clean and the red dust temporarily tamed into a dark, rich mud. When Isabella emerged from behind her curtain, Elias was already awake, sitting at the small table, examining a broken hinge on one of her cabinets. He had a small knife in his hand and was skillfully carving a tiny wooden pin to replace the missing metal one. He worked with a quiet, focused competence that was at odds with his disheveled appearance. He didn't seem to notice her at first, wholly absorbed in the task. When he did, he immediately stopped, as if caught doing something wrong. "The hinge was loose," he said, his voice a low rumble. "It would have broken soon." Isabella simply nodded, accepting the unspoken offering. It was his first contribution to this strange, new household, a small payment in skill for the sanctuary she had provided. He was not a man who could abide charity. He needed to be useful. This was the beginning of their language, a vocabulary built not of words, but of actions. That day, he repaired the hinge, reinforced a wobbly table leg, and sharpened her kitchen knives on a whetstone he produced from his pocket. And Isabella, in turn, cooked, washed their few clothes alongside her own, and read a chapter from a book to Sarah, whose quiet attention was a reward in itself. A fragile routine began to form, a silent treaty negotiated in the small, confined space of the wagon. The treaty negotiated within the wagon did not extend to the town of Devil's Hollow. Their strange cohabitation was a scandal, a juicy morsel of gossip to be chewed over and savored by the righteous and the bored. When Isabella walked to the mercantile for supplies, with Elias trailing a respectful 10 paces behind, the whispers were no longer subtle. They were sharp and pointed, meant to be overheard. "Shameless," hissed a woman in a faded calico dress, her face pinched with disapproval, taking in that vagrant and his litter. In her wagon, no less, the woman was Elspeth Gable, the wife of a man on the town council, and she considered herself the arbiter of the Hollow's moral compass. Her pronouncements carried weight. The storekeeper, who had once been polite enough, now served Isabella with a sullen reluctance, placing her goods on the counter with a thud. He would not meet her eyes. Elias, for his part, endured the scorn with a stoic impassivity that Isabella suspected was a well-worn shield. He stood outside the store, his gaze fixed on the distant bluffs, pretending not to hear the insults. But she saw the tightening of his jaw, the rigid set of his shoulders. The town's judgment was a poison, and he had been drinking it for a long time. Isabella, however, had not. She was new to this brand of overt cruelty. Back east, judgment was a more refined, subtle affair, a veiled comment, a pointed exclusion from a guest list. This was raw and brutish, and it ignited a cold fire in her. One afternoon, as she was inspecting a bolt of sturdy cotton, Mrs. Gable approached her, two other women flanking her like sour-faced acolytes. "Mrs. Whitmore," she began, though Isabella had never been a Mrs., a word of concern. "For your reputation," Isabella turned slowly, her expression placid. "You are concerned for my reputation, Mrs. Gable?" "Of course," the woman said, her lips barely moving. A single woman, of good breeding it would seem, taking up with a man like that. And his children. "It is not decent. People are talking, let them talk," Isabella said, her voice quiet but carrying a distinct chill. She deliberately turned her attention back to the bolt of fabric. "This cotton is of poor quality. Do you have anything better?" Mrs. Gable was momentarily stunned into silence by the abrupt dismissal. She sputtered, "Well, I never. It is for the good of the town. We cannot have such arrangements. It sets a poor example." Isabella met her gaze directly, her own eyes as hard and unyielding as flint. "The example I am concerned with, madam, is the one that allows children to go hungry while others whisper about decency. If you are so concerned with the town's good, perhaps you should direct your energies toward compassion rather than conjecture." She placed the bolt of cotton back on the shelf with a decisive thud, paid the stunned storekeeper for her other items, and walked out of the store, her back ramrod straight. Elias was waiting where she had left him. He had heard everything through the open door. As she approached, he looked at her, and for the first time, she saw something other than suspicion or weary pride in his eyes. It was a flicker of grudging respect. That evening, the silence in the wagon felt different. It was less a void and more shared space. As she mended a tear in young Jacob's shirt, Elias spoke, his voice low. "You shouldn't have done that." "Done what?" she asked, not looking up from her needlework. "Spoken to her that way. To Mrs. Gable. She'll make things harder for you." "For us, it is of no consequence to me what Mrs. Gable thinks," Isabella replied coolly. "She doesn't know you," he persisted, a note of frustration in his voice. "She doesn't know anything. She knows she can say what she likes without being challenged." Or she thought she knew. She finally looked up, meeting his worried gaze. "Some things, Mr. Boone, must be challenged." He fell silent, watching her fingers work the needle with quick, precise stitches. The shared adversity was beginning to forge something between them, an unspoken alliance against the town that had condemned them both. Later that night, after the children were asleep, she heard him stoking the small fire in the stove. The night had turned cold again. She emerged from behind her curtain to find him staring into the flames. "She's right about one thing," he said, not turning around. "It isn't decent. You, in here with us, decency is a warm bed and a full stomach for a child," Isabella countered, her voice soft in the quiet space. "The rest is just noise." He finally turned to look at her, the firelight casting flickering shadows across the harsh planes of his face. He seemed to want to say more, but the words would not come. Instead, he simply gave a slow, somber nod. It was an acknowledgement, an agreement. They were in this together now, a strange and embattled family of five, besieged in their fortress of oak and canvas. The cold fire of Isabella's defiance had warmed her resolve, but it had also stoked the embers of Mrs. Gable's indignation into a blaze. The woman, unused to being challenged, saw Isabella not just as a sinner, but as a threat to the established order. She took her crusade to the town council, framing her gossip as civic concern. Within a week, Sheriff Miller appeared at the wagon, his hat held in his hands, his face etched with a discomfort that did little to soften the blow he was about to deliver. Elias was outside, splitting firewood he'd scavenged, the rhythmic thud of the axe the only sound. He stopped when he saw the sheriff, his body going still and wary. Isabella stepped out of the wagon, sensing the gravity of the visit. "Mom, Elias," the sheriff began, nodding to them both. He cleared his throat, avoiding their eyes. The council had a meeting. There's been concerns raised. About the children, Elias's hand tightened on the axe handle. "What about them?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. "It's the law, Elias. You have no property, no steady work. The children aren't in school. They're considered, well, the term they used was vagrants. The word hung in the air, ugly and sharp. The council has petitioned Judge Merrickover in the county seat. They're arguing you're an unfit guardian. They want to have the children made wards of the county. Sent to the orphanage in Sterling, the world seemed to stop. The air grew thin and sharp. Isabella looked at Elias. The color had drained from his face, leaving behind a gray, haunted mask. She saw in his eyes the terror of a man who had already lost everything and was now facing the loss of the only thing he had left. His strength, his quiet resilience, seemed to collapse inward, leaving only raw, helpless panic. He looked at his children, who had come to the door of the wagon, drawn by the serious voices. Sarah's small hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with fear. The orphanage. It was a word whispered like a curse, a place from which children rarely returned, swallowed by institutions and hard labor. For a moment, Isabella felt the same cold dread creep into her own heart. The faces of the children, who had just begun to unfurl like timid blossoms in the warmth of the wagon, now looked frozen with terror. But then, as the sheriff mumbled some apology about just doing his job, another emotion rose up in her, fierce and hot, burning away the fear. It was outrage, a pure, unadulterated fury at the blind cruelty of it, at the hypocrisy of a town that would rather tear a family apart than offer a hand. This was no longer about propriety or reputation. This was a battle for the lives of these children. "When is the hearing?" she asked, her voice so cold and level it made the sheriff flinch. "Judge is a circuit judge. He'll be here in 2 weeks' time," he said, clearly eager to be gone. "He'll hear the petition, then." As the sheriff retreated, Elias sank onto the chopping block, the axe falling from his hand. He put his head in his hands, his broad shoulders shaking. "They'll take them," he whispered, his voice choked. I can't lose them, too." Isabella went to him, placing a hand on his shoulder. It was the first time she had touched him with such deliberate intent. His muscles were rigid with despair. "They will not take them," she said. It was not a reassurance. It was a vow. He looked up at her, his eyes filled with a hopelessness so profound it was like looking into an abyss. "Ow! I have nothing. I am nothing." "They're right, they are wrong," she said, her grip on his shoulder tightening. "You are their father, and you are a good one. That is not nothing. That is everything." But she knew that in the eyes of the law, love was not legal tender. They needed more. They needed power. They needed a weapon the council would understand. That night, long after Elias and the children had fallen into a troubled sleep, Isabella stayed awake. The fury had settled into a hard, clear resolve. They had underestimated her. They saw a fallen woman, a charity case herself. They had no idea who she was. She thought of her father, a man who had revered the law, who had built a mercantile empire on contracts and ledgers. He had taught her that power was not always loud. Sometimes it was written on paper, bound in leather, and kept under lock and key. She looked at the heavy, iron-strapped chest stowed beneath her bunk, a chest no one had seen her open. It contained the remnants of her old life, the tools of her father's world. They thought they were fighting a destitute spinster and a vagrant. They were about to learn they had declared war on Isabella Whitmore. The next morning, an air of grim determination had replaced the despair in the wagon. Isabella moved with a newfound purpose that was sharp and decisive. She gave Elias his instructions with a calm authority that left no room for the doubt that still shadowed his eyes. "You will look after the children," she said. "You will not engage with anyone from the town. Do not answer their questions. Do not rise to their provocations. You will simply wait for me." She was already dressed for travel, not in her usual practical dress, but in a severe, dark wool suit of a quality Devil's Hollow had never seen. It was the armor of her former life, the uniform of a woman of business. Before she left, she knelt before the heavy chest under her bunk. Using a small, intricate key she wore on a chain around her neck, she unlocked it. Elias and the children watched in silence as she lifted the heavy lid. Inside, nestled in velvet lining, were not the sentimental keepsakes of a spinster, but stacks of official-looking documents bound with ribbon. There were deeds to properties in Philadelphia, bank drafts from the most reputable institutions in the East, and stock certificates. And beneath them all, a thick leather-bound ledger. She removed a specific portfolio of papers and a small, heavy purse that clinked with the solid sound of gold coin. She placed them in a satchel. Elias stared at the contents of the chest, his expression one of utter disbelief. The sheer, tangible weight of the wealth and legitimacy stored in that box was staggering. It was more money than he had ever imagined existed. He looked from the chest to Isabella and saw her not as the kind but stranded woman who had offered them shelter, but as someone else entirely, a person of immense and hidden power. "What?" he started, his voice a hoarse whisper. "My father was a meticulous man," she said simply, closing the lid and locking it. "He did not believe in leaving things to chance. Neither do I." With that, she hired a horse and buggy from the liveryman, who was so taken aback by the crisp banknote she offered that he forgot to be sullen. She set off for Sterling, the county seat, a full day's journey away. The trip was a passage back into a world she understood. Sterling was a proper town, with paved streets, brick buildings, and a courthouse that stood as a testament to order and law. She found the office of a man her father had once corresponded with, a lawyer named Silas Croft. He was an old, hawk-faced man with eyes that missed nothing. He remembered her father and greeted her with a cautious respect. She did not waste time with pleasantries. She laid her situation out with stark, dispassionate clarity. The death of her intended, her stranding in Devil's Hollow, the family she had taken in, and the town council's legal threat. Then, she opened her satchel and laid the documents on his polished desk. As Croft examined the deeds, the bank drafts, the proof of her inheritance, his eyebrows climbed higher and higher. He looked up at her, his expression transformed from cautious respect to profound astonishment. "Good heavens, Mrs. Whitmore, Miss Whitmore," she corrected him quietly. "By all accounts, you are one of the wealthiest unmarried women in this territory. My financial standing is not a matter of public record," she said. "I prefer it that way, but is a tool I will use if I must. The Council of Devil's Hollow believes me to be a destitute dependent. It is a miscalculation I intend to use to my advantage. Tell me, Mr. Croft, what is our strongest position?" The lawyer leaned back, steepling his fingers. He was no longer dealing with a damsel in distress, but with a formidable client. He began to think like a strategist. The petition against Mr. Boone is based on his perceived instability, his lack of property, income, and a spouse. They paint him as a lone, indigent man incapable of providing for his children. He paused, looking at her. The simplest, most unassailable defense would be to demonstrate that the children are part of a stable, two-parent household with significant financial means and a respectable standing. Isabella met his gaze, her own expression unreadable. She had anticipated this. She had considered every angle on the long ride to Sterling. Her heart, a thing she had long thought dormant, beat a slow, heavy rhythm in her chest. It was a radical, life-altering step. It was also the only one that guaranteed victory. "Then that," she said, her voice betraying no tremor, "is what we shall give them." Isabella returned to Devil's Hollow not with a plan for a legal fight, but with a blueprint for a new life. The quiet determination she had left with had been honed into a sharp, gleaming purpose. She found Elias by the creek, watching the children skip stones across the shallow water. There was a fragile peace in the scene that tore at her heart, a peace she was about to irrevocably alter. He saw her approach, and the anxious hope in his eyes was painful to witness. He was expecting news of a legal strategy, a clever argument to be made in court. He was not prepared for the revolution she was about to propose. She did not lead with pleasantries. Her father had taught her that in matters of great importance, directness was a form of respect. Mr. Croft, the lawyer, agrees the town's petition is weak, but that a judge might still be swayed by their claims of your instability. Elias's face fell. So there's no hope. On the contrary, Isabella said, her gaze steady. There is a way to make their petition utterly irrelevant, to render it void before it is even heard. He looked at her, confused. Ow! She took a breath, the dry, dusty air filling her lungs. This was it, the moment her life, and his, and the children's, would pivot. The court wants to see a stable home, a father with means and support, a mother for the children, a legally recognized family unit. She paused, letting the words settle. Elias's brow furrowed, still not grasping the implication. Mr. Boone. Elias, she said, using his given name for the first time. The sound of it hung between them, intimate and strange. I am proposing that you and I get married. The silence that followed was absolute. The only sound was the distant chatter of the children and the whisper of the wind through the dry grass. Elias stared at her as if she had just confessed to being a creature from the moon. Disbelief, shock, and a deep, wounded confusion wore in his eyes. Marry you? He finally managed, the words rough and incredulous. You can't be serious. I have never been more serious in my life, she replied, her tone unyielding. It is a practical solution to an urgent problem. As my husband, you would share my legal and financial standing. The children would have a legal mother. We would present the court with a marriage certificate, proof of funds, and a deed to land. There would be no grounds to remove the children. The case would be dismissed. He shook his head, running a hand through his matted hair. This is madness. You don't know me. I am what I am, a broken man. I have nothing to offer you. You are wrong, she said, her voice softening for the first time. You are a good father. You are a capable, decent man who has been dealt a terrible hand. And you have everything to offer these children. I am simply offering a way to ensure you can continue to do so. But a marriage, he stammered. It's a lie. A piece of paper. It's not real. It will be as real as the law requires, she countered. It will be a partnership, a business arrangement, if you prefer to see it that way. The business of protecting your family. My assets will secure their future. Your name will give me a place in this world. It is a mutually beneficial contract. She saw the pride warring with the desperation in his face. He looked over at his children, laughing now, oblivious to the monumental decision being weighed on their behalf. His love for them was the sun his entire broken world orbited. Isabella saw his resolve crumbling, not before her logic, but before that love. I cannot ask this of you, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. It is too much. You are not asking, she said gently. I'm offering. Will you accept my offer, Elias? He looked from his children back to her face, this strange, determined woman who had descended upon his life like a force of nature. He saw not pity in her eyes, but strength. He saw a solution, a deliverance he never could have imagined. He finally gave a long, slow nod, a gesture of surrender and awe. Yes, he said, the word barely audible. 3 days later, they stood before a justice of the peace in Sterling, with Silas Croft as their sole witness. Isabella wore the same severe suit, Elias a clean but worn shirt she had mended for him. The children waited outside, cared for by the lawyer's wife, understanding only that something important was happening. The justice of the peace droned through the words, his tone bored and procedural. But to Isabella and Elias, the words were a spell, a legal incantation that was binding their disparate lives together. I now pronounce you man and wife. There was no kiss. There was no celebration. Elias simply took her hand, his calloused palm enveloping hers. It was not the touch of a lover, but of a partner, a comrade in arms. They were no longer Isabella Whitmore and Elias Boone. They were Mr. and Mrs. Boone, a legal fact, a fortress against the world. As they signed the register, Isabella felt a strange sense of calm settle over her. She had not come to Devil's Hollow for this. She had come for a respectable, predictable life with a man she knew from letters. Instead, she had found a broken, beautiful family and had forged a union not of affection, but of sheer, unyielding will. It was not the future she had planned, but for the first time since arriving in this desolate land, it felt like a future she was choosing for herself. The return to Devil's Hollow was silent, but charged with a new reality. The marriage certificate, a simple piece of paper with curling, official script, lay in Isabella's satchel like a declaration of war. They were no longer living in sin or charity or any other category the town could devise. They were a family sanctioned by the very law the council sought to wield against them. The hearing was scheduled for the next day in the town's small meeting hall, which doubled as a church on Sundays. News of Judge Merrick's arrival had stirred the hollow, and the hall was filled with the same curious, judgmental faces from the mercantile. Mrs. Gable sat in the front row, her expression radiating a smug, righteous certainty. She was about to see her civic duty done, to cleanse the town of its unsightly elements. She nodded curtly at Sheriff Miller, who looked profoundly uncomfortable. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation. Judge Merrick was a stern, humorless man with a reputation for efficiency and a low tolerance for disorder. He called the hearing to order, his voice booming in the small room. He read the petition from the town council, his words clinical and damning. The father, Elias Boone, being without home or stable employment. The children, Thomas, Sarah, and Jacob Boone, living in a state of vagrancy. It is in their best interest to be made wards of the county. Elias sat beside Isabella, his hands clenched into fists on his knees. He was clean-shaven, his hair trimmed, wearing a new shirt Isabella had bought him. He looked respectable, but inside, Isabella knew he was vibrating with terror. She placed a calming hand on his arm. Then, the judge looked at them. "Mr. Boone, what say you to this petition?" Before Elias could speak, Silas Croft, who had ridden in from Sterling that morning, stood up. "Your Honor, if I may, I represent Mr. and Mrs. Boone." The title hung in the air, causing a ripple of confused murmurs through the crowd. Mrs. Gable's smug expression faltered. "Mrs. Boone," the judge asked, his eyebrow raised. "Indeed, Your Honor," Croft said smoothly. "Miss Isabella Whitmore and Mr. Elias Boone were lawfully wed in Sterling 3 days ago." He produced the marriage certificate and handed it to the bailiff, who delivered it to the judge. A collective gasp went through the hall. Judge Merrick examined the document, his expression unreadable. "This appears to be in order. Nevertheless, the matter of financial stability remains, if I may address that." "Your Honor," Isabella said, rising to her feet. She did not wait for permission. She spoke with a clear, steady voice that commanded the room's attention. The timid, grieving woman who had arrived weeks ago was gone. In her place stood a figure of immense composure and authority. "My name is Isabella Whitmore Boone. My late father was Marcus Whitmore, of Whitmore and Sons Mercantile, Philadelphia. Upon his death, I inherited his entire estate." She gestured to Mr. Croft, who stepped forward and placed a portfolio on the judge's bench. "These documents, Your Honor, are bank drafts, property deeds, and stock holdings in my name. To summarize, my personal assets are in excess of $50,000. The silence in the room was now absolute, a thick, breathless void. $50,000. It was a mythical sum in a place like Devil's Hollow, an amount beyond comprehension. Mrs. Gable's face had gone from smug to slack-jawed, her complexion a mottled white. She looked as if she had been slapped. "Furthermore," Isabella continued, her voice cutting through the shock, "I have this morning, through Mr. Croft, purchased the 100-acre parcel of land directly east of town, known as the Old Miller Claim. We intend to build our home there. My husband, Mr. Boone, will be the foreman of our small ranching operation." She was improvising now, building their future right there in front of the stunned assembly. The children will be enrolled in the school here as soon as a suitable teacher can be retained, a salary for which I will personally provide, should the council find itself unable. She turned her gaze from the judge and let it sweep across the faces of the townspeople, finally landing on Mrs. Gable. Her eyes were not angry. They were cold, clear, and utterly dismissive. My family will want for nothing. Any suggestion that my husband is an unfit father is not only baseless, it is slanderous. Should we hear any further such talk, or should my family be subjected to any more harassment, I will instruct Mr. Croft to file a civil suit against the responsible parties and, indeed, against this entire town council for malicious persecution. Are my intentions clear? She sat down. The entire confrontation had taken less than 5 minutes. Judge Merrick looked down at the portfolio, then at the stunned council members, then back at Isabella and Elias. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched the corner of his mouth. In light of this new information, he said, the dryness in his voice unmistakable, I see no merit whatsoever in this petition. Case dismissed. He banged his gavel, the sound echoing the finality of a coffin lid shutting on the town's prejudice. The people filed out in a daze, avoiding eye contact, whispering in hushed, awed tones. They had not just misjudged her. They had misjudged the very nature of the world. Power did not always wear a sheriff's badge or sit on a council. Sometimes it arrived quietly in a polished wagon and waited patiently for its moment to speak. The legal victory was absolute, but the air in Devil's Hollow remained thick with a strange mixture of resentment and awe. The townsfolk now looked at Isabella and her family with a new kind of distance, not of scorn, but of intimidation. They had not been won over. They had been defeated. The family retreated to their wagon, now parked on the edge of the sprawling acreage Isabella had purchased. The land was theirs, a tangible piece of their new life. Yet they remained in the temporary shelter, a symbol of their journey. A fragile peace settled over them. Elias began to walk the land each day, his steps losing their weary shuffle and gaining a new purpose. He was no longer a vagrant, but a landowner, a foreman. He measured fence lines, tested the soil, and spoke of the future, of a barn, a well, a small herd of cattle. He was coming back to life before her eyes. The children, secure in the knowledge they would not be taken, blossomed. Thomas's defensiveness softened, replaced by a boy's natural curiosity. Jacob's laughter became a frequent sound, and Sarah, quiet Sarah, began to follow Isabella everywhere, a small, devoted shadow. She would sit for hours while Isabella read, her finger tracing the words as if to absorb their meaning through her skin. But nature, in this part of the world, was an entity far more powerful and indifferent than any town council. For days, the sky had been a strange, oppressive yellow. The air was thick, heavy, and unnaturally still. The birds fell silent. Elias would scan the horizon, his face tight with a familiar anxiety. "A storm's coming," he said one evening, his voice low. "A bad one. It arrived just after dusk, not with rain, but with a terrifying, violent wind. It shrieked through the hollow like a banshee, a physical force that seemed intent on scouring the land clean. The wagon, which had been their fortress, strained and groaned against the assault. Isabella gathered the children into the center of the small space, trying to shield them from the terrifying noise. Elias worked frantically outside, trying to secure extra ropes, his figure a silhouette against the eerie, lightning-filled sky. Then came the hail, stones of ice the size of hens' eggs, hammering against the canvas roof with the sound of 1,000 gavels. The children cried out in terror. Isabella held them tight, her own heart pounding against her ribs. Elias tumbled back inside, his face bleeding from a cut on his cheek, his eyes wild. "The big oak on the ridge," he yelled over the roar. "It's swaying." The ancient tree, a landmark for generations, stood on a rise directly above them. The wind howled, a rising crescendo of fury. And then came a sound that was not wind or hail, but something deeper, more elemental. A splintering, cracking roar that seemed to come from the very bones of the earth. Elias lunged, grabbing Isabella and the children, pulling them down to the floor and covering them with his own body just as the world exploded into chaos. The sound of 1,000 tons of wood and history crashing down upon them was deafening. The wagon splintered, the sturdy oak beams snapping like twigs. The roof was torn away, and for a terrifying second, Isabella saw the writhing, storm-filled sky before darkness, and the crushing weight of their destroyed home descended upon them. When the roaring stopped, there was only the sound of the wind, the rain that had finally begun to fall, and Jacob's terrified whimpers. They were alive, trapped in a small pocket of survival beneath the shattered floorboards and the massive trunk of the fallen oak. Elias, bruised and battered, pushed away debris, his breathing ragged. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice strained. One by one, they answered, scraped, terrified, but miraculously whole. Their sanctuary, the polished vessel of Isabella's old life and the cradle of their new one, was utterly destroyed. They huddled together in the wreckage, soaked by the pouring rain, waiting for the dawn. The storm raged for hours, and then, as suddenly as it had begun, it passed. The rising sun revealed a scene of utter devastation. The magnificent wagon was a pile of splintered wood and torn canvas, crushed beyond recognition beneath the colossal oak. Their few possessions were scattered and ruined, soaked and mud-caked. It was all gone. As they crawled from the wreckage, surveying the ruin, they were not alone. Figures were emerging from the town, not with judgment, but with worried faces. The storm had terrorized the entire hollow. The first to arrive was the sheriff, followed by the storekeeper, Mr. Hemlock. Then came others, men and women who had scorned them just days before. They stopped and stared at the devastation, at the families standing amidst the rubble, covered in mud but alive. Mrs. Gable's husband, a quiet man perpetually in his wife's shadow, stepped forward, holding a lantern. "My God," he breathed. "We saw the tree go down. We thought—" He didn't finish. He didn't need to. For the first time, the people of Devil's Hollow were looking at them not as a scandal or a curiosity, but as neighbors who had suffered a terrible blow. The law had humbled them, but it was the indiscriminate fury of the storm that had stripped away the last of their prejudice. In the face of nature's power, their petty cruelties seemed foolish and small. There, in the ruins of the wagon, something new began. Without a word, Mr. Hemlock went back to his store and returned with blankets and a jug of hot coffee. The sheriff started directing men to bring saws and axes. "Let's get this mess cleared," he said, his voice rough with an emotion that sounded almost like compassion. They had lost their sanctuary, but in its place, they had found a community. The morning after the storm marked a sea change in Devil's Hollow. The destruction of the wagon, a tragedy that could have been their final undoing, became an unexpected catalyst for grace. The same hands that had pointed in judgment now reached out to help. Men who had muttered insults behind their backs now worked shoulder to shoulder with Elias, their saws biting into the massive trunk of the fallen oak. The sound of chopping and hauling filled the air, a rhythm of communal effort of atonement. Mrs. Gable herself appeared, her face pale and drawn. She did not approach Isabella directly. Instead, she silently handed over a large basket filled with bread, cheese, and smoked meat, her eyes refusing to meet Isabella's before she turned and hurried away. It was not an apology, but it was an acknowledgment, a concession offered in the face of a power greater than her own social standing. Mr. Croft's wife took the children into her own home in town for a few days, giving them a warm, safe place to recover from the terror of the storm. The plot of land that Isabella had purchased, once a symbol of defiance, now became a site of shared purpose. With the wreckage of the wagon cleared, the sheriff, who also had some skill as a carpenter, unrolled a crude building plan he'd drawn on a piece of butcher paper. "It's not much," he said gruffly to Elias and Isabella, "but it's a start. A solid 2-room house. We can get the frame up before the first snow if we all pitch in." And they did. The project took on a life of its own. Mr. Hemlock donated lumber from his own small mill. Others brought nails, tools, and food for the workers each day. It became the town's penance, their collective act of rebuilding not just a house, but the very fabric of their community. Isabella, a woman of means who could have hired builders from Sterling, understood the significance of this offering. She accepted it with a quiet, formal grace, providing funds for the materials they could not scavenge or donate, working alongside the women preparing meals, her fine clothes now replaced with a simple, practical dress. She was no longer an outsider, but a part of the Hollow's ecosystem. Elias, meanwhile, was transformed. He directed the work with a quiet confidence that seemed to have been buried deep inside him. He was a man who knew how to build, how to work the land, and the townsfolk, seeing his competence and tireless labor, began to treat him with a newfound respect. They stopped seeing the vagrant and started seeing the man. The house rose from the red earth, a testament to resilience. It was simple and sturdy, its fresh pine walls smelling of the future. As the roof was being finished, Isabella and Elias stood watching, a light autumn breeze stirring the dust at their feet. The children were playing nearby, their laughter a sound of healing. The raw, desperate partnership forged in the wagon had been tested by law and by nature, and it had held. Something more profound had begun to grow in its place, a quiet affection built on a foundation of mutual respect and shared survival. They moved in as the first flakes of snow began to fall, christening the new roof. The house was sparsely furnished with items donated or hastily purchased, but it felt more like a home than the polished, perfect wagon ever had. It was a place born not of a single person's dream, but of a community's effort. It had roots. That evening, as the snow fell softly outside the new glass-paned window, Isabella sat by the fire, mending a shirt. The children were asleep in the new room they shared, safe and warm under quilts sewn by the women of the town. The little house was filled with a peaceful quiet. Elias came and stood behind her chair, placing his hands on her shoulders. His touch was gentle, tentative. It was a gesture that went beyond their practical arrangement. "I never thank you, Isabella," he said, his voice a low rumble. Not properly. She stopped her sewing, leaning back slightly into his touch. "There is no need, Elias. We are partners. It's more than that now," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he had held back for so long. "What you did for my children, for me. You came here looking for a home, and you built one for us instead. Out of nothing." She turned in her chair to look up at him. The firelight softened the harsh lines of his face, revealing the deep well of gratitude in his eyes. He was no longer the broken man she had found by the creek. He was whole. He was home. "We built it together," she whispered. He shook his head slowly, his calloused thumbs stroking her shoulders. "You gave us a life, Isabella. And he struggled with the words, his pride and reticence a final barrier to fall. He knelt before her, taking her hands, the needle and thread falling forgotten to the floor. He looked at her, his gaze direct and filled with a raw, undeniable truth. "I love you, Isabella." The words were simple, unadorned, and more powerful than any legal document or bank draft. They were the foundation of this house, the mortar that held the stones together. Isabella's carefully constructed composure finally melted away, replaced by a warmth that spread through her entire being. She had arrived in Devil's Hollow seeking a life of respectable order, a safe harbor from grief. She had lost that future on her first day. But in the dust and desperation, in the face of judgment and the fury of the storm, she had found something far more real. She had found a man's shattered heart and helped to mend it. She had found 3 orphan children and made them her own. She had found a home, not the one she had planned, but the one her soul had been searching for. She leaned forward and, for the first time, kissed her husband. It was a kiss not of passion, but of profound peace, a promise of countless quiet evenings just like this one, a testament to the resilient, unshakable power of a family chosen and a love earned.